December 12, 1944, 22:15 hours. The intelligence report that crossed Eisenhower's desk that night didn't announce itself with sirens or urgent courier dispatch. It arrived in a manila folder, stamped and summarized. Just another G2 analysis in a war that generated thousands of pages weekly. But what that single page revealed wasn't about troop movements or weapons counts. It exposed a truth Eisenhower had been avoiding for months. The Allies had been fighting the wrong war. In the next minutes, Eisenhower would discover that Germany wasn't positioning its defenses against Allied strength. It was positioning them against one man. This video reveals how German fear of Patton reshaped their entire strategy, how politics forced Eisenhower to suppress that truth, and how that same fear would later help break Hitler's final offensive in the West. Versailles, France. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower's office sits deliberately isolated from the operations floor. Privacy was essential at this level, but tonight the isolation feels heavier than usual. A cigarette burns between his fingers, forgotten. Wall maps stretch across the room. Colored pins mark Allied progress. Montgomery's 21st Army Group dominates the north, advancing slowly, methodically, with overwhelming resources. His forces receive priority logistics. Fuel flows toward him like blood through arteries. On paper, Montgomery commands the decisive front. But Eisenhower's eyes aren't on Montgomery. They're on a single line in the interrogation summary. German armored reserves, positioned against anticipated Patton breakthrough. Montgomery sector, adequate screening forces only. He reads it again, then again. The meaning doesn't change. Germany isn't concentrating its strength against the Allied main effort. Germany is concentrating against Patton. 4.5 million Allied soldiers operate under Eisenhower's command, the greatest coalition army ever assembled. Yet the German High Command is not positioning its decisive reserves against the largest force. They are positioning them against the most dangerous one. Patton commands barely a quarter of Allied strength. His army runs on borrowed fuel, delayed shipments, and improvised logistics. Yet German planners treat him as the primary threat, not Montgomery, Patton. The realization is unsettling because it suggests something Eisenhower cannot admit aloud. The Allied strategy itself may be politically correct, but psychologically wrong. By December 1944, Eisenhower isn't simply commanding armies. He's managing egos, governments, and fragile alliances. Montgomery represents British prestige. Every victory in his sector reinforces Britain's position as an equal partner in the coalition. Churchill watches his progress personally. Every supply allocation toward Montgomery carries political meaning beyond the battlefield. Patton represents something entirely different: aggression, momentum, fear. He advances even when logic says he shouldn't. He attacks when logistics say he can't. He creates uncertainty where German planners crave predictability. Montgomery fights like an engineer. Patton fights like a predator. And Germany fears predators. Ultra-intercepts confirm it. German communications repeatedly reference Patton's sector. Requests for armored reserves cluster near his axis of advance. Defensive planning prioritizes flexibility, not strength. They are not preparing for where Patton is. They are preparing for where he might appear next. Captured German officers confirm it directly. One panzer commander explains during interrogation, almost reluctantly, Montgomery advances according to calculation. Patton advances according to opportunity. Calculation can be countered. Opportunity cannot. The difference isn't tactical. It's psychological. Montgomery's methodical advances create predictable threats. German commanders identify preparation phases, reinforce sectors, establish fallback lines. Containment is possible. Patton offers no such comfort. He advances before preparations finish. He exploits weaknesses before they are recognized. His attacks violate expectation. He forces German commanders to defend everywhere at once. Fear spreads faster than armor, and fear forces mistakes. Eisenhower understands immediately what this means. He has been allocating resources based on geography. Germany has been allocating resources based on fear. The two strategies are not aligned, which means Eisenhower has unknowingly limited his most powerful weapon. Not Patton's tanks, Patton's unpredictability. He pulls logistics summaries from the previous months. September, Montgomery receives overwhelming fuel priority for Market Garden. Patton receives enough to maintain pressure, but not enough to break through decisively. October, Montgomery continues receiving priority despite Arnham's failure. Patton's requests are delayed. November, minor adjustments, nothing decisive. Every decision was politically correct. Every decision was strategically logical. Every decision was psychologically wrong. Because German defensive posture proves one undeniable truth. Germany fears Patton more than Montgomery, but Eisenhower cannot simply reverse priorities overnight. Doing so would humiliate Montgomery publicly. It would anger Churchill. It would fracture coalition unity. Victory requires alliance cohesion, even when cohesion limits efficiency. Eisenhower stares at the map. The visible war is clear. The invisible war is clearer, and invisible wars are won differently. He lights another cigarette. He cannot announce change. He must embed it, quietly, subtly, without triggering political backlash. Because the most powerful weapon he possesses is not one he can officially deploy. It is German fear, and he is about to weaponize it. London received the American position in the early hours of December 30th. The telegram from Washington was not ambiguous. It was not diplomatic in tone. It did not suggest discussion. It made one fact absolutely clear. The United States stood fully behind Dwight Eisenhower. If the British government supported Montgomery's challenge to Supreme Headquarters, they would not simply be arguing over rank. They would be challenging American authority at the very center of the Western Alliance. At 10 Downing Street, Winston Churchill read the cable slowly. Then he read it again. He understood the stakes instantly. By late 1944, the balance of power within the alliance had shifted decisively. American divisions outnumbered British formations in Europe. American factories produced the bulk of Allied aircraft, tanks, trucks, fuel, and ammunition. American logistics sustained the entire advance into Germany. Britain was still a major power, but no longer the dominant one. If this became a test of wills between Montgomery and Eisenhower, Britain could not afford to lose American confidence. Churchill summoned Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, before dawn. Brooke had long supported Montgomery's operational instincts. He believed the British commander was tactically gifted, methodical, and often correct in his assessments. But this was no longer a debate about tactics. Churchill spoke bluntly. This is not about strategy. This is about authority. Montgomery is attempting to force a change in command by political pressure. That is insubordination in all but name. Brooke argued that Montgomery's frustration stemmed from genuine concern over coordination during the Ardennes crisis. Churchill cut him off. Even if so, threatening to bypass the Supreme Commander was unacceptable. If Britain defended that move, the Americans might conclude the alliance itself was conditional. And if that happened, everything would fracture. Churchill drafted his own message to Montgomery that morning. It was courteous in wording, but unmistakable in substance. The field marshal was to withdraw his demand immediately. No appeal to Washington, no escalation, no further discussion of altering command structure. The alliance must remain united under Eisenhower's authority. In Belgium, Montgomery received Churchill's directive along with indirect confirmation that Washington stood firmly behind Eisenhower. For a brief moment, he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. He had believed that British prestige, his own battlefield reputation, and political backing at home would give him leverage. Instead, he had isolated himself. The Americans were unified. Washington had chosen its commander, and Churchill, facing geopolitical reality, would not jeopardize the alliance over one man, however senior. Montgomery's chief of staff reportedly saw the shift immediately. The demand must be withdrawn at once. Within hours, Montgomery drafted a second telegram. The tone was transformed. Where the earlier message had been assertive, this one was conciliatory. He expressed regret that Eisenhower felt concern. He reaffirmed his loyalty to the Supreme Commander. He stated clearly that he would serve under existing arrangements without reservation. Whatever Eisenhower decided regarding command structure, he would support. The reversal was swift and complete. At Versailles, the telegram arrived on December 30th. Eisenhower read it quietly. There was no triumph in his reaction, no visible satisfaction, only acknowledgement that the immediate crisis had passed, but something fundamental had changed. On January 1st, 1945, Eisenhower issued new directives. They were precise. The temporary arrangement placing American armies under Montgomery would end as soon as operational conditions permitted. 1st and 9th Armies would return to Bradley's command. Boundaries were clarified. Authority lines were reinforced, and most importantly, the directive explicitly reaffirmed that the Supreme Commander exercised final authority over all Allied ground forces in the European theater. There would be no appeals beyond that structure. The message traveled quickly through headquarters. Officers who had grown accustomed to friction sensed the difference. The era of quiet absorption was over. Eisenhower had drawn a line, not publicly, not theatrically, but decisively. From that point forward, the relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery remained professional, but never again warm. Meetings became formal. Discussions became brief. Strategic disagreements continued, but within clearly defined limits. Montgomery no longer threatened escalation beyond Supreme Headquarters. American commanders noticed the shift immediately. Bradley later wrote that December 29th marked the moment Eisenhower stopped trying to satisfy every national sensitivity and began asserting command without hesitation. George Patton, rarely restrained in private opinion, expressed open approval that the line had finally been drawn. Yet the broader significance went beyond personal rivalry. Coalition warfare is inherently fragile. It requires balancing national pride, strategic necessity, and political survival. Leaders must compromise constantly, but compromise cannot replace authority. Without a clear chain of command, armies hesitate, and hesitation in war costs lives. Eisenhower had compromised repeatedly throughout 1944 to preserve unity. He had absorbed criticism after Market Garden. He had tolerated public framing that minimized American contributions during the Bulge. He had accepted temporary shifts in operational control for practical reasons. But there is a boundary beyond which accommodation erodes legitimacy. Montgomery crossed that boundary when he threatened to alter command through political pressure rather than military channels. Eisenhower's response carried risk. If Washington had wavered, his resignation would have plunged the alliance into crisis. If Churchill had chosen national loyalty over strategic reality, fracture might have followed. But Eisenhower judged correctly that clarity was now safer than continued concession. The Battle of the Bulge itself would soon turn decisively. American counterattacks tightened the salient. Bastogne was relieved. German momentum collapsed. By late January, the Ardennes offensive had failed completely. When the final drive into Germany resumed, command lines were unmistakable. The Western Alliance advanced under unified direction. Disagreements persisted, as they always do in coalition operations, but no further challenge to Eisenhower's authority emerged. The episode revealed something essential about leadership under extreme pressure. Eisenhower was often described as political, diplomatic, overly accommodating. Yet those qualities were not weakness. They were tools. He used them to hold together a coalition spanning continents. But diplomacy has meaning only when backed by the willingness to act. On December 29, 1944, he demonstrated that willingness. He did not raise his voice publicly. He did not denounce his subordinate. He did not stage a confrontation. He wrote a telegram, and in that telegram he made clear that authority would either be respected or surrendered entirely. It was a gamble, but it worked. Montgomery remained in command of the 21st Army Group. Eisenhower remained supreme commander. The alliance endured, and the war in Europe moved steadily toward its conclusion. Sometimes the most decisive battle in a war is not fought in snow or mud or steel. Sometimes it is fought across desks, in cables, in the measured phrasing of official language. For 48 hours in late December 1944, the Western Alliance stood at a crossroads. Pride confronted authority. National ambition confronted unified command, and one man chose clarity over comfort. Eisenhower understood something fundamental. Defeating the enemy required more than armies. It required trust in the structure guiding them. Once that structure is questioned, victory itself becomes uncertain. On that winter evening in Versailles, he risked everything to preserve it, and the alliance was stronger for it. Which moment in this confrontation do you think truly decided the outcome?